Is there places at the beach where we could sit?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me your full first name.
Okay.
Tell me your full first name.
Okay, I'll give you both of them. Okay. My name is Raymond Milian, aka Ramon Jose Milian Moura. I was born on September 24th, 1941, on Manhattan Island, New York City, at Manhattan Hospital. My family lives on 109th Street in Spanish Harlem. When I was born, I was the third born. Uh, my family moved to the Bronx when I was about 3 years old. Uh, my father's name was Modesto Milian Escobar. He was from San Lorenzo, Puerto Rico. My mother's name was Guillermina Moura Anes Westerbrand. She was from Ponce, Puerto Rico. Um, my parents were both born and raised in Puerto Rico, as I mentioned. Uh, my parents were of different uh, racial appearances, but they were both, first and foremost, Puerto Rican. I mentioned this because there are so many places in the world, particularly in the United States, where you know your race comes first before your nationality. In Puerto Rico, it's somewhat different, thank God. I was the third of five children. My older brother was uh, Juan Milian, also known to all of us as Johnny, born in 1937. My the second born was my brother Modesto, who was born uh, 1939, 1938. Um, I was born in 1941, as I mentioned. Then there was my brother Bobby Roberto, who was born 4 years after me, um, and the last to be born was my brother Victor, uh, and we all were all educated in the South Bronx. We lived at 759 East 155th Street. That block no longer exists anymore. It was wiped out. Now there's a housing project in that same place, about a block from the Jackson Avenue uh, subway station. When I graduated from PS 52 as a present from my parents, uh, the gift for graduation was to send me to Puerto Rico uh, for my very first time, having never seen it before in my life. Despite the fact that in my home, Spanish was the first language, English was spoken outside of the house. I spent a great deal of time during my upbringing with my grandmother, who lives around the corner. It was not really my grandmother; she was my mother's aunt and my great aunt. But she helped raise my mother after her biological grandmother died. So we always referred to her as our grandmother. Spent a great deal of time there, and of course, the language, the extensive use of Spanish in literature, in poetry, in song, and everything was Spanish. We finished in Puerto Rico. I was enamored with the environment, and I wanted to stay. So I told my parents that I would stay with my aunt, who was a school teacher, lived in Santurce. And, um, and so I started high school here in Puerto Rico at Valdoriotti de Castro High School on Tanca Street in Old San Juan. My father wanted to have us all together, and he insisted, and so on and so forth. So I came back to New York, much to my chagrin. But I had planned on going to Bronx High School of Science. But I chose to go despite the fact that I was going to be left back by a semester having started high school in Puerto Rico. I went to what was then at the time called the Manhattan High School of Aviation Trades on 62nd Street between 2nd and 3rd in Manhattan. In my last year of school, they moved the high school to Long Island City, and that's where I graduated. I started late, so I graduated. Instead of graduating in June of 1959, I graduated in January of 1960. My mindset was on going into aeronautical engineering, you know, and there was no special programs or anything else. The only place that taught aeronautical engineering was Rensselaer University. We had literally no money. There was no future as far as that was concerned. And there was no real guidance to speak of either. I mean, nobody, when I got to the 9th grade, I remember the guidance counselor in high school, when I told him that I wanted to go to Bronx Science or whatever, he said, why don't you go to Bronx Vocational and, you know, like your brothers? And I just looked at him and I said, I don't want to cut wood. Uh, and he just, you know, he looked at me like I was, you know, like I was crazy. I remember very vividly, there were so many unions that were dominated by the Irish and the Italians and so on and so forth. They couldn't get a job, you know, at all.
Was
You
it
know,
because of race or?
race, yeah, absolutely. You know, you couldn't get into those unions, you know, because at that time, all these things, all construction, everything was dominated by the Italians and the Irish and so on and so forth. And so there was a lot of that. In our home, we always had curious because at least as far as I was concerned, because I spent a great deal of time with my grandmother and my great aunts, there was always an axiom that was always repeated. I learned a great deal about my ancestry through the older people in my family, and there was an expression that was always used: "Nunca mancha la memoria de tus antecedentes." So that would, and that always stuck with me. You know, it wasn't the fear of going to jail for a crime. It wasn't the the it was it was the internal or the conscious shame of doing something that would shame my family or those that came before me and those that sweat and blood and everything for the land that we now call Puerto Rico. Whether they were cane cutters, whether they were servants, whether they were whatever it was, that side of my mother's family. And the long and the short of it is also that part of my father's family, who were essentially very fair white, and they were from the mountains of Puerto Rico. And in short, they may have been a short story, but they did their part, okay, eventually, as far as the history of Puerto Rico was concerned. And so that was always very important to me, you know, the whole concept of, you know, where you came from, you know, and the object of never shaming your family. That was a great part of my upbringing with my grandmother and my great aunt and so on and so forth, and my mother, that part of our family. I went to all the different services, and having come from a family that had lots of Marines and paratroopers and so on and so forth, going all the way back for years and years, the Second World War, I said, no, I looked at all the services and they weren't offering me anything until I went to the Navy. And I was fortunate enough that the recruiter was an aircraft mechanic. And I took a battery of tests and whatnot, and I wound up, you know, thanks to him, he told me, you know, to be a mechanic in the service is to take off one part and put on another. He says, you qualify for a lot of things that are better. So I wound up in naval aviation electronics, and that's what I did. They sent me to school for almost a year in Jacksonville. The cultural shock of being in the south of the United States in 1960 was absolutely incredible. It was difficult Not that I had never been exposed to racism, but blatant discrimination was shocking to me, so much so. And having come from a background where, thanks to my mother and my mother's family, I was never taught how to bow my head, you know, and play that kind of game to try to get along. As a consequence, I would prefer to walk than be obligated to sit in the back of a bus. And I did that one day with another guy by the name of Maltby, whose grandmother lived there on the outskirts of Jackson. We walked 11 miles one day because I wasn't going to sit on the back of the bus. Um, Conflicts, racial conflicts, and so on and so forth. Like I joke about it. I said, you know, basically, the United States Navy and eventually the Marine Corps were not ready for me. So it was that simple, you know. And speaking with a New England with a New York accent and so on and so forth was shocking for a lot of people who, because of my appearance, there was an assumption that I was an African American and came from an American culture. No, I didn't. You know, I looked the same, but I came from a different culture. Not that it was any better or worse or anything else, but it was different. But and it was my time in the service from for a long time. Uh, there was always a conflict of that. People would stare at me because uh, uh, I would have people walk up to me and say, you know, how come you speak with a Yankee clip? You know, I said, well, you know, I don't know. I'm a native New Yorker, number one, you know, so, which was, you know, I look back on it in retrospect, you know, people criticize New York, but back New York of the 40s and 50s and so forth was an absolute godsend. Puerto Rico was a U.S. territory. The training was extensive as far as Spanish literature was concerned, music and everything else. So I was always curious about why my mother would sing songs. She'd be cooking, she'd be singing songs that were typically Spanish, not Puerto Rican. And she had a very extensive vocabulary. And because of it, at that time, from the second grade on up in Ponce, English was taught as a second language. Packed her up, and they got on a boat, and they went to New York. The object of the exercise was she had already finished school. She was going to go study at NYU. That was the game plan. There were the Puerto Rican population in New York was very small, and they had an organization, like an association of Puerto Ricans, where they had their dances and social meetings and so on and so forth. Uh, and that's where she met my father. They grew together and so on and so forth. And essentially, my mother never continued her studies or anything else. Got married, and 5 children later, you know, living in a third floor walk-up, you know, that took care of that. My mother never finished her dreams. My father's culture was entirely different than my mother's. Culturally, they may have been from the same island, essentially same language with its limitations. Because my father's Spanish, he spoke it very well, but the vocabulary was limited. So we all wound up, you know, the first three of us were born in Manhattan in Spanish Harlem. The rest of us were born in the Bronx, raised there. The outcome of that was what avenues were available, what was available to us as far as, you know, guidance of any kind and so on and so forth, and financial assistance as far as further education was concerned. It was extremely limited, you know, extremely limited. The, the, the armed forces was the way out. Here was, to give you an example of how limited so many things were, difficult for some people to understand in today's day and age. My brother Johnny, who was trained in woodworking, he could build a house by himself. He was the whole thing. Instead of going to a construction battalion in the Army, they put him into an MP battalion. He got trained as an MP. And you know, after he was in Korea at Panmunjom, okay, when they were still shooting at each other, you know, during the peace talks, from there he wound up being exposed to the atomic bomb test in the Southwest. From there, he was in Germany. He spent a lot of time in Germany, and so on and so forth. And then he got out and he figured, well, I'll go into the police department. Impossible. The police department was dominated by the Irish, a sprinkling of Italians, two or three blacks, and that was it. There was no way in the world he could get into the police department. He eventually wound up as a car cleaner, working as an aide for the Veterans Administration Hospital. When I was paralyzed from the waist down, my brother took care of me in the hospital when he was an aide, a nurse's aide, my brother Johnny. And so that was, and from there he left and he became, he started out as a car cleaner with the Transit Authority, and eventually he worked his way up to conductor, and from conductor he became a motorman, and he retired as a motorman, and he moved to upstate New York after years before, and he traveled back and forth, and my brother eventually died of prostate cancer, okay, which was unfortunate. My brother Junior went into the Navy. They didn't give him any schooling to speak of, but they made him a machinist mate. And he did his couple of years in the Navy and so on and so forth, got out, and he became a factory worker for the rest of his life. He worked his way into several supervisory positions and whatnot, but never went on to get an even further education as far as college was concerned. Myself, I was always somewhat stubborn. I got out of the service, and I followed basically the same track. I did what I learned in the service. So I went to work for a company that gave service to different kinds of equipment and so forth in the engineering department. It's a nice name for service. Mm-hmm. And I worked all over the country. I mean, I was treated like a king. It took them 3 weeks of continuous interviews to hire me. And it was an Italian company out of Torino, Italy. I was fortunate enough to being well versed in Spanish. I could read the engineering documentation, and that was in Italian, and wound my way through it. And I worked in a multitude of different cities all over the United States as a troubleshooter and so forth. I was treated very well, very well. I was promoted to #1 Park Avenue in New York, and I was very friendly with one of the assistants, admin people there. We went out to lunch one day, and she informed me of something that I found a little shocking. She basically told me that I had been hired to fill a quota. Okay?
Wow.
It wasn't because I was Hispanic, it's because of what I looked like. Okay? And we're talking about, this is the late 60s, the mid 60s, when I had gotten out of the service. And it really bothered me. I was single, and to quote the typical New York axiom, it pissed me off. And I walked into the office on a Friday afternoon after everybody left the office of the national personnel manager who had hired me originally. And I challenged him on that. He hemmed and hawed and so on and so forth. I'll be right back. I sat down, I wrote out my resignation, and I gave it to him. And he told me, you don't have to do this, so on and so forth. And I told him, I said, in today's day and age, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's not how I grew up. And I told him in his face, I want to be paid for what I know, not for what I look like. And I walked out without a job. And I took a course in programming and so on and so, make a long story short, that didn't go anywhere. And because of my background in electronics, I went to IBM, and I went to work for IBM. I spent 11 years working for IBM. I started in New York. By then I got married, I had a little girl, and my apartment on 226th Street was robbed by the only other Puerto Rican that lived on that whole street, and in my building. I had no idea he was a junkie. He broke into our apartment twice in 2 weeks. Okay, that took care of that. That was enough for me. I got on the phone. I called the service manager in Puerto Rico for IBM. Gilberto Valls was his name. I asked him if they needed any technicians. I was a specialist in teleprocessing and peripheral equipment and so forth. He says, of course. I transferred to Puerto Rico in 1968. My wife remained in New York with my daughter while I made the arrangements for living. I moved in with my aunt on 260 Tapia Street. I lived with my aunt, and and like I say, I don't go to church every day, but there's got to be a God, because when I went to buy a house, I had a VA guarantee, but I didn't really know how that worked. And the bank said I had to have money for closing costs. Well, I didn't have any money. You know, my salary was the same salary I was making in New York at that time. It was like $650 or $700 a month. Okay, and they said you need money for the closing costs, and it was several $1,000s at that time. And I said, I don't have any money. And then I started thinking about it. IBM, God bless them, had a program where you could put part of your money every month that you got paid into buying stock.
401k.
No, it wasn't 401k. It was a special program where you could buy, if you accumulated that day, you accumulated enough in a special fund to buy a share of IBM stock below market price. They automatically bought it for you, and they sent you the certificate. And I said, wait a minute. So I got up and I went back to where I was living with my aunt, and I went in the closet and took out this shoebox, and I took it to the bank. I had $7,000 in IBM stock that I didn't even know what it was worth.
Wow.
The bank, through its trading department and so on and so forth, they dealt with it and so on and so forth, and that took care of that.
Wow.
So in September, I arrived in Puerto Rico the 30th of July, 1968. In September, I bought the house. My wife and daughter came to Puerto Rico. We moved into the house on December 18th, if I'm not mistaken, of that same year. There were no screens on the window. The house smelled like paint. We were the first family on that entire street.
Now, this was in Levittown.
Levittown, the same house I live in today.
Yeah. But you know, Levittown has an interesting history with race, and William Levitt didn't want black people or minorities to live in his homes. Was that?
Oh no, I tried to buy a house on Long Island, Levittown, Long Island. There was a guy that worked with me, ex-Navy type, great guy. White as the driven snow, blonde hair, blue eyes. His father worked for the British Embassy. And Bob Misson was his name, I still remember. And he bought a house in Levittown. I said, boy, it's a great idea. I'm married down, blah, blah. He said, don't bother. And he read the riot act to me. He told me, he said, don't bother. He says, you're not going to be able to buy a house there. He says, how do they get away with it? I said, he says, they won't accept GI guaranteed loans, which is a twist, because the VA is not giving you any money. They just stand up in case of default, okay? And so I said, wow, how about that? You know.
Interesting.
So
you were able to buy one here in Puerto
Rico. I was able to buy one in Puerto Rico. That was not a problem in Puerto Rico, but it was in Long Island, New York.
It was. Interesting. Well, I was told, your son told me, that you were the first black stockbroker on the island.
That's correct.
Rico. Is that true?
That's true.
What happened there?
You're not going to believe how I became. When I graduated from college, when I graduated and got my little 2 degrees and so on and so forth, night school and so on and so forth, worked days for IBM. I was in the Coast Guard Reserve on weekends and so on and so forth. I walked into my house, and there was no celebration. You know, my kids were overjoyed. My wife, you finished school, so on and so forth. And I figured, I told IBM, say goodbye. You know, IBM, an interview I had with the regional personnel manager who came down from New York, he says, I understand you're going to school. I said, yeah. He says, well, what are you taking? I said, business and economics and so on and so forth. And he says, well, why don't you take engineering? He says, I'll put you into one of the plants upstate. As God is my judge, I could see a picture of my father in my brain. And I just looked at him and I said, I don't want to work in a factory. He says, oh, you don't? Well, maybe you better start looking for a job now. Those were his exact words. His name was Leonard Toole. I still remember. And I said, maybe you, and I was a super tech. I was hardworking, the whole 9 yards. Put out fires for everybody. And you know what? I said, I'm not going to stay here. So when I finished school, without a job, erroneously thinking that people will be knocking down my door for so many years of experience and so on and so forth, and now a couple of academic degrees and so on and so forth, I told IBM to keep their job, okay? I wasn't going to stay there. And I walked out the door without a job. I was unemployed for a long time.
And you were living here in Puerto Rico.
I was living right here in Puerto Rico, and I couldn't get a job. Everywhere I went, I was overqualified or underqualified or whatever. It wasn't even a matter of race. It was a matter of you know, you walk in, you fill out your resume, take your resume, so on and so forth, and they take. I remember I went down the coast. There used to be a guy that by the name of Wolf was his last name, and he had an operation in aviation where they would get these Islanders, a type of aircraft, twin engine plane, pull them out of a swamp, and refurbish them and make them brand new. An operation in Dorado, which no longer exists. I walked in there, gave him my resume. He read the resume and so on and so forth. You know how to do this? You know how to do that? You know how to do this? Yes, I do. I just blah blah blah. And he looked at me straight up and he said, you know, we don't need any prima donnas around here. I said, I'm not a prima donna. I'm a man, a working man with children. You know, he never hired me. Therein, there may have been an inkling of race, okay? That and 2 degrees and so on and so, which was on my resume, you know, he said, this guy's not going to be here long, okay? All right. So I was never hired. And I was looking at everything. I'm talking about, you know, a Bell Aircraft was looking for people for maintenance on aircraft and so on and so forth to work in Saudi Arabia. I applied, okay? The CIA was looking for people, okay, to deal with aircraft systems and so on and so forth. And so I applied, okay. They did a background check, decided not to hire me. You know, a multitude. I was going to go to work anyway. I finally wound up going to work selling cheap office equipment. Okay, and I wound up teaching basic electricity and basic electronics at a little private school in Rio Piedras for a little while. What sustained my family during that period were two things. One was that a friend of mine was the vice president of Seatrain, a maritime transportation company. Of course, the docks are controlled by longshoremen, the unions, and so on and so forth. But any time that they had a problem, okay, where he could help me out, he called me. And so I worked as a stevedore on Pier 15, 35, 40, 45 hours at a shift, straight through, on my feet, at $6 an hour.
Wow.
To feed my family. I also would sit to get I applied for coupons, and I go sit and apply for coupons. I'd be the only man there, all the women sitting there. I was the only man there because my wife refused. That nobody told you to quit IBM, blah, blah, so on and so forth. I'd sit there, you know, I get ragged at home, and I'd sit there and apply for coupons. Be the only man there, the only man sitting there with all these women staring at me. You know, like, you know, he looks healthy. What is he doing here, you know?
Coupons, you mean like food stamps?
Food stamps, yeah. Couponing, yeah. So I did that. And then one day, there's an ad in the paper where there was a company called Securities Corporation of Puerto Rico. What I didn't know it at the time. It was the only completely local securities operation, stock brokerage operation in Puerto Rico, and they were looking for stockbroker trainees. I, what did I know about stock? My only experience with stock was my IBM stock that I used to, and I bought my home and so forth. I had no idea about the stock market. My my kids had to eat, and there was another issue here also. I was a reservist with the Coast Guard. I was enlisted at the time, and I I asked the Coast Guard if I could do, instead of doing my 2 weeks of active duty, I could do a little more time. Or found out something in the system that would allow me to do it. So instead of doing 2 weeks, I would do a month of active duty and get paid, okay, while I was doing it. And so my family could eat, and I could keep a roof over their head, okay? So I did that. I did a multitude of different things, you know,
Took odd jobs, did any?
whatever I could do, whatever I could do. My family had to eat, you know, and I remember that my father working for the, you know, I heard about it, I never saw it, WPA that Roosevelt put together, you know, my father digging ditches, you know, so his wife and children could eat, you know. So my father could do what I could do. So I unloaded ships. My life was threatened by a lot of people. Whenever I would show up, I didn't work. I worked anytime this buddy of mine would call me. I'd show up at 2 o'clock in the morning as a shape up, and so on and so forth. After my life was threatened because everybody would go by this guy, big, tall, black guy dressed in white, looked like a santero, and everybody would give him some money. I kept on walking. I had I think it was $2.75 in my pocket, and 2 sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. I walked right by him, and I hear the guy walk up behind me. Mira negro, ¿qué pasa? And he walked up and he put his hand on my shoulder. I turned around and put a gun right in his face.
Oh wow.
Okay. I said, no pasa nada. He says, I know. He didn't even blink. He didn't even blink. I mean, it was like it was no big deal. Okay.
Somebody putting a gun in his face.
Yeah, it was no big deal. You know, anybody else would have been shaken. No, this guy was, you know. And I always remember the guy. He was all dressed in white. He was black, but he was all dressed in white. And he had a broken arm. His arm was in a cast. And I said, cuando tú quieras. He said, nos veremos. We'll see each other. I said, anytime you want. I turned around and kept on walking down to the pier where I was walking on. All right, that was like about 2 o'clock in the morning. So I wind up in a hold of a ship doing general cargo. And all of a sudden somebody shows up and says that they needed a couple of people to store boxes and whatnot in one of the sheds, you know, on shore. So I climb out of the ship, I come down the ramp, you know, and I walk into this, and I see this old man that's standing there, and I'm thinking to myself, where do I know this old man from? And then it comes to mind, where do I know him from? We had a party on one weekend when I was with the Coast Guard Reserve, and we needed like paper plates and cups and so forth. So we go into an area of Old San Juan called Puerta de Tierra, okay, and to a grocery store. And the man is standing there, and we're in uniform, myself and another guy. And he says, you know, you guys are from the Coast Guard. He said, yeah. He says, well, I'm a stevedore. I've been working all my life, you know, on the docks. And we spoke to him briefly and so on and so forth. And we bought what we had to buy and we left. And I said, that's where I saw this man. Okay, it was a couple of years before. And he looked at me and I looked at him. He didn't say a word. I didn't say anything. And on the docks, they have their own culture, you know. You know, to insult your mother is almost like saying, you know, good morning, how are you? You know, you know. You know,
So
I mean,
how
it's a
did that
different
lead
world.
into you getting the
Okay,
security
how
job?
that led into that was the following: in that when I go and work in the shed, I hear him. Somebody talked to this old man, and he said, somebody that was talking to him says, "Se va a formar. There's going to be something's going to happen here." He said, "What?" He says, "Because somebody challenged this guy. The guy was collecting money on the dock." And he said, "No shit." He said, "Who?" And he says, "The guy that was working in the hold. He looks like this, so on and so forth." The old man saved my life. He said, make the word, run the word around. Nobody should touch him. And the other guy said, why not? He says, because he's federal. I've seen him here inspecting ships and so on and so forth. You mess with that guy, this place is going to be loaded with the FBI. They never touch me. Okay, so here I am, and I see this ad in the newspaper where they're looking for stockbroker trainees. I would have gone to work at anything.
Yeah.
So I went to the interview, and I was interviewed by several people. The guy that was the president and owner of the firm was called Tito Montilla, and his right-hand man was a man from the States, an older man by the name of Carol Lewis. And Carol Lewis and both of them, they interviewed me. I didn't really even know how to write out a good resume or anything. My resume, I don't know how many pages it was, And I gave it to them and so forth. They looked at it, they interviewed me. And Tito Montilla said, I'm going to be honest with you, you've been you come from an engineering and a technical background all your life, this is not that. This is completely different. This is administrative, this is marketing, selling, high-level securities, and so on and so forth. What do you know about that? He says, I think you're a nice guy, but what I think you should do, he says, I think you should go to one of the big houses, if they employ you, get some experience, and maybe come back in a year or two and we'll talk. And I just looked at him and I got up and I said, you see my resume? I said, don't throw it away. I said, I'll be back. I walked out the door. Okay. The next day, there was a guy I knew had a dive operation out in Vieques, and his partner was coming into San Juan to renew his driver's license at that time. You couldn't do it in Fajardo, you had to do it in San Juan. And if I could pick him up and take him to a motor vehicle and so on and so forth. I said, yeah, sure. I took him. So on the way back, we stopped at the small airport, East Lagundia Airport. I'll tell you what things were like. The telephone was a dime at the time. And I said, Pete, have you got a dime? He said, what for? I said, I just want to call my house. Bear in mind, I
You were
didn't have
that
a
broke.
beeper.
You had to borrow a dime.
I borrowed a dime.
Right.
I borrowed 2 dimes. I borrowed a dime from Pete Baumgartner was his name. He passed away. And I said, I got on the phone and called my house just to find out if anybody, many of the multitude of companies, I mean, I had applied over 300 companies, here, locally, internationally, the whole nine yards. And I left IBM in June of that year, and here we were in January of the following year, okay? And I wasn't really in any real job of any sustenance to speak of. And so as a consequence, I called my house, and my wife says, do you know a man by the name of Carol Lewis from Securities Corporation of Puerto Rico? Carol Lewis, white, older man from Beaufort, South Carolina. What I didn't know at the time was that Carol Lewis was the guru. He was a walking encyclopedia of the securities business in Puerto Rico.
Really?
And he was one of the people who interviewed me. So the outcome of that was, he says, this man called, he says he wants you to call him. I go back to Pete, I said, Pete, can I borrow another dime? Incredible. I say, I don't go to church, but there is a God.
Right.
I called the number that my wife gave me, and he says, we're interested in having you come in, being part of the team, so on and so forth. He says, when can you start? I said, right now. Right?
Because you needed the money.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I said, right now, okay? So he says, no, you come in tomorrow. You get a chance. You come in by the office tomorrow. Anyway, I got interviewed again by him and by everybody. I found out later on why I was hired. I got hired with 4 other people, and they all came from money.
Right.
They were socially connected and so on and so forth and everything else. And I got hired and we started our training. It was the first time in Puerto Rico that ever was given a actual classroom training for brokers. It was never done before.
Right.
It was always done by your correspondence courses, or they'd send you off to the States or someplace or whatever, and so on and so forth. At that time, you could not take a Series 7 license exam
On the island.
on the island. You got on a plane, you had to go to New York and take it at the New York Stock Exchange.
Okay.
Wow.
I found this on the web for Series 7 license exam
Oh,
on the island.
Oh, this thing is
Check it
fun.
out.
Anyway, the issue is this. I spent 4 months in training, 3.5 to 4 months in training with them, 5, 6 days a week. And uh, I got hired because Carol Lewis insisted. This is a white Southerner, insisted. And many people always felt that, well, you got hired because somebody had to fill a quota and hire a black guy or something, you know. I found out different. He got into a pissing contest with Tito Montilla, who didn't want to hire me because I want that guy. And the reason why I got hired was the following reason. It's irony is irony. Because I was 36 years old, going to be 37. I was married, had 4 children, you know, ex combat veteran. I was in the Coast Guard Reserve. I had gone to night school and gotten a couple of degrees and so on and so forth. The irony of all ironies, Carol Lewis, when he got into the brokerage business, number one, he had worked on he had worked on Guam for some years. But in addition to that, when he got into the brokerage business, he was 37 years old. He was married with 4 kids, and he was an ex-merchant marine officer. And he told Tito Montilla, I want that guy. Okay? That's the reason why I was hired. It had nothing to do with color. And Carol Lewis and I remained friends until he died. Okay? He died in Lynchburg, Virginia. Died in the States. And that's why I got hired. And the curious part of it is that we talk about racism in Puerto Rico. Well, the other 4 people that I was hired with after the first couple of months, they went to see Carol Lewis, who was one of multitude of instructors. The man was a walking encyclopedia with the brokerage business. And they came to him, they wanted to know why I was there with them. Okay,
And these were people in Puerto Rico that
people in Puerto Rico, they were basically racist. You know, they all came for money. They were all of them were white, and so on and so forth. They all came for money. One of them, his father, who was from the States, was an American married to a Puerto Rican stepmother of his, and he was one of the partners of one of the major national CPA firms in the States, and so on and so forth, and with offices in Puerto Rico. And Carol Lewis's answer, I found this out later on. He looked at these people and he said, you know something? This guy is not only older than the rest of you, he knows more than the rest of you, and so on and so forth. But if you don't like it, there's the door. Don't let it hit you in the ass.
Right.
That was Carol Lewis's answer. This is a white, older Southerner from Beaufort, South Carolina. That was his answer. When Puerto Ricans didn't want to hire me, he insisted. Okay? There was no quota. We had similar backgrounds. So so here I was, and I traveled to New York, and I'll tell you how many, I already been away from this, was like 1978, okay? 1978. I left IBM in 77, so here we were in 78, and I had to go to New York to take the test at New York Stock Exchange. And I managed getting to, I had no idea, you know, how the hell to get there. You know, I ran into some people on the subway, which is another story. It turns out that they were fellow Masons, and I was already a Mason at that time. And I looked at them, it was like 6 o'clock in the morning on the train. Now, where the hell, how do I get to this place? I was with the international unit that were brokers that were coming in to take tests from Germany, from Japan, from Korea, and so on and so forth. You had to take 4 hours of examinations in the morning and 4 hours in the afternoon, you know, to get licensed. So I did that. And I come back. When I come back, you know, Tito says, well, there's going to be your desk. This is going to be your desk, you know. You start doing your thing, you know, blah, 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 so on and so forth. That was the first day when I had a desk. At that point in time, this guy was going to start building a car in Puerto Rico, and Securities Corp of Puerto Rico was going to be the intermediary, and he was supposed to sign with us. Well, this was my first day of work. In the afternoon, Tito says, I got to go to La Fortaleza to talk to the governor to iron out this whole thing. DeLorean. It was the DeLorean car that was going to be built in Puerto Rico.
Okay.
So he goes back. Tito was a tall guy, good looking, blah, blah, so on and so forth. And he comes back in the afternoon with tears in his eyes. And he looked at us, he says, DeLorean stabbed us in the back. Last night, he signed with the Irish and the British government instead of signing with Puerto Rico. By now, Securities Corp had even rented an apartment in New York to make it easier to get back and forth and deal with him. He'd come to Puerto Rico all the time, DeLorean and so on and so forth. And, you know, he went the other way.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I always suspected the American government had a lot to do with it. They didn't like the idea that he was building a car out of stainless steel, with a special bonding application where the paint would stick to the stainless steel. Okay? And that was going to kill General Motors and a lot of people. So anyway, that's another story. He wound up on charges of buying drugs and so on and so forth. You know. Anyway, so that it went down the tubes, and now Securities Corp is overextended as the middleman, and it works like the banks. You can only have so much liability and so many assets in place. They had to close their doors. And Tito came out with tears in his eyes. He said, we were supposed to have that evening, we were supposed to have a champagne cocktail celebration at the Bankers Club.
Celebrating the DeLorean deal.
The DeLorean deal. He said, anybody has received, at that time, there were maybe there were 40 at most, total stockbrokers in Puerto Rico. Maybe, and at most, I mean, in the entire island. And here I was a brand new broker. You know, I had a license, but so what? So he says, if anybody's, and we were always being offered, the other guys were always being offered positions in their houses like Payne Weber and so on and so forth. The Beige Halsey Stewart and so on and so forth. Everybody was always trying to pull the guys away, pull people away. And if anybody's got been receiving offers, take them, because we have to close the doors.
Right.
So a lot of people were running off to Payne Weber. Okay. Carol Lewis gets a hold of me. He says, don't go there. He says, those guys do all kinds of illegal shit and so on and so forth. You don't want to get involved with them. Go downstairs. We were in the same building as Merrill Lynch. I probably held a record for God knows how many years for the hiring at Merrill Lynch. Because he says, talk to Walt Albani, who's the VP at Merrill Lynch. He says, they're very straight-laced. They do things by the book. He says, go down and talk to them. That same afternoon, I went downstairs, walked in the office. The guy looked at me, who are you? I said, I was with Securities Corp. He said, I came down, I was referred to you. We sat down. We didn't talk for more than about 20 minutes. He says, can you wait outside for a minute? I said, yeah, sure. I went, I left his office, I sat outside in the general waiting area. He calls me, I came back inside. He says, that's your desk, you start tomorrow.
Wow.
20 minutes. He got on the phone and called Carol Lewis. Carol Lewis said, take him. So I went to work, and I worked for a bunch of years for Merrill Lynch.
You eventually went into business for yourself.
Oh, that was years later. But I mean, then after that, I worked for Merrill Lynch. I got offered a position in investment banking with another firm, and I worked for them. And I was working, the guy that ran the operation there, era cubano. I was there because this other guy brought me in, but he didn't really care for me. you know. And I didn't like his attitude toward me, his racist attitude, and so on and so forth. So when I got and by then I was an officer in the Coast Guard Reserve. I had gone to the Command and General Staff School that the Army ran at Fort Buchanan, a bunch of things on my own, non-paid, and so on and so forth. And the phone rang, and they wanted to know if I could be activated and so on and so forth. I said, "What do you got?" He said, "Well, it's classified." And the long and the short of it is that I wound up 5 years on active duty. But I wound up keeping my license alive. How did I do that? I got on the phone. I called the young lady who was still alive, I was her best man when she got married, who worked for A.L. Williams. A.L. Williams, in addition to life insurance, they also sold uh, mutual funds. In order to sell mutual funds, you have to have at least a Series 6 license, which is nothing. Okay, I had a Series 7 license, a General Securities license, which more than covered it. So I kept my license alive for the 5 years I was in active duty with A.L. Williams, in addition to doing business for them
Right.
in insurance and in mutual funds and so on and so forth. And it went very well while I was on active duty. I leave Venezuela, I get sent out to California to put out a legal fire that the Coast Guard had with an outfit called Image. Mexican American Government Employees Association was suing the Coast Guard for the lack of Mexican Americans working in their as civilians on their bases in the West Coast. I went out there. I put out that fire right away. I went to churches, spoke to people, and so forth, and would go out at night and help them fill out the forms and everything else. The admiral out there was happy as hell. So they asked me to stay out there. In order for me to stay out there, I had to be qualified and certified as a civil rights investigator in the military. So they sent me to DOMI, Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, for 4 months, 3 months, at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. And I finished up there, got certified, went out there and started doing investigations related to civil rights and sexual harassment and a bunch of other things. Great job, I loved it, okay? And after a couple of years out there, the phone rings. They wanted to know if I was available to transfer back to Puerto Rico for this monstrous maritime operation called Gran Regata Colón 92. So I came back and from the West Coast, and myself and another officer spent a year and a half planning that operation from soup to nuts. Intelligence, local agencies, federal agencies, national parks, everybody, FBI, the whole 9 yards, putting all the pieces together. It went off like clockwork. And when it was all done, but then again, you have to wear a lot of hats. Whenever there was an oil spill, I have to respond. Whenever they were short on officers to pull people out of the water, Cubans, Dominicans, Haitians, whatever, I had to lend a hand and so on and so forth. You wear a lot of different hats. And
Do you
so,
have any you have any regrets about life? I mean, you've lived a very full life.
oh yeah, regrets. There were things that I could have done. I could have done like some other people have done after my wife and children got involved with Jehovah's Witnesses and so forth. I could have played the game, you know, like I've seen other people do, and hold their marriages together and so forth. But hypocrisy was not my middle name. It wasn't. I wasn't big on that.
You said that you didn't come from a family where you bowed your head and went along.
No. And after 3 years of hearing, you know, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to. No, you continue with that because those are your beliefs, they're not mine. You know, so on and so forth. So I went on. I never denied my children. Always gave them the time, and found time for them. Even when I was here in Puerto Rico, when I was away, I'd be on the phone, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So regrets on some things. There were things that I could have gone and asked more questions about. I could have found a way to go to Rensselaer, become an aeronautical engineer. I could have found a way to maybe have listened. I developed an interest in the law later in life, after I took a course in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, because I used to fight a lot. I stopped fighting. After I took a course in Uniform Code of Military Justice in the military, I stopped fighting. I put people on report and came in front of the captain and sent them to jail. You know, that's it. I never threw another punch. You know, I didn't have to.
Right.
You know, and I got involved with the law, and the concept of your being having to stand in front of the law when you're in your mother's stomach, and long after you're dead and you're buried, you're still subject to the law. So I took an interest in that. And so I started doing a little reading and so on and so forth. And I had to deal with the law as far as the job I was doing for the Coast Guard. You know, whether it was maritime law, whether it was civil law, whether it was criminal law, whatever it was, I had to learn a little bit about it and so on and so forth. Despite the fact that I never became a lawyer or anything else, I had to deal with part of that. So I always got interested in the concept of being a paralegal. Okay, which I never really got certified at. But the years went by. I remained a total time, if we include the time of, if we take away the 5 years that I was on active duty, I was a stockbroker, a licensed stockbroker for 30 years. Make it 25 with the absence of the 5 years on active duty.
Wow.
When I came back, I went to work for the brokerage operation at Citibank. I retired from Citibank, and when I retired from Citibank, I started my own business as a broker. I did all my clearing, which went extremely well for me. But at that point in time, my grandson was born. He was like 3 years old, and I could swear that he was autistic. And I said, you know what, I'm not going to work anymore. I made a lot of money.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it was a different ballgame. I didn't have to work for a corporation. I did my own thing. And as far as taxes, I became very well versed in how to handle taxes as an independent business owner. That went very well for me. If I made $100,000 a year, you know, what would have an actual tax posture? Sometimes half or less than half of that. Okay. Because there were write-offs that could be applied and so on and so forth. So I did very well, but my grandson's health was more important to me than money. I literally stopped working.
Right.
And what I did was that I took the little guy with me everywhere I went. I mean, I'd go shopping at Fort Buchanan. I'd go travel around everywhere I went, you know, so on and so forth. I took him with me. And, you know, so that went well. When they moved to North Carolina, I said to myself, well, I'll go back to work, even if I have to take a new exam, whatever. And you know, I said, I looked at the world around me and I said, no, I'm not. And what I was doing, I did basically a lot of pro bono work for free for ex-clients of mine. When I walked out of, I managed between 32 and 34 million dollars at Citibank, and with all the different accounts that I had. And everybody told me, if you go off on your own, man, you know, you're going to starve to death. You don't have that Citibank name behind you, and so on and so forth. I basically left because of the corruption that I saw. Not in my division. It was very highly regulated by the federal government. But other areas of the bank I'm talking about, man, there was things going on you would not even believe that you wouldn't believe could go on in an American bank.
Wow.
And I said, this is not for me. I was fortunate to run into a young man that worked in human resources who was an Army brat, an ex-Army brat, and I talked to this kid by the name. His name was Brown. His father, African-American, married to a Puerto Rican woman. He grew up on Army bases all his life. His parents lived in Puerto Rico and so on and so forth. And he always took a liking to me because I was ex-military and so forth. And he was the one that told me. He said, "How old are you? How long you been with the bank? So you qualify for retirement." I said, "No kidding. I was gonna leave, with nothing. I walked out with all the bennies and everything else. Yeah, because of him." Okay.
You've lived a very good life. You live a
Oh
very
yeah.
full life.
I asked a lot of questions. Pissed a lot of people off.
Any advice you would give to someone my age?
Yeah. Take a look at the world around you and figure out how you're going to make it work for you. That was the attitude that the Jews that I grew up with had. Take a look around. What am I going to do with this? You live in South Carolina, there's probably a zillion things you can do there, okay? That will deal for you if you keep focused on what you want, okay? And I stumbled into a lot of things that were beneficial to me by simply stumbling into them, not because I had the brain power or anything else. I stumbled into a lot of things, and they worked for me. And I had a lot of, my going back to school, for example, and getting an education, because I saw myself being a technician. I said, you know something, there isn't a great deal of difference between me. My tie is the only thing that separates me from the guy that was cutting sugar cane in Guayama or in Ponce and so on and so forth. I got to do something about this, besides having an absolute thirst for learning, okay? And I went out and I did it, okay? And I don't know what they say in South Carolina or what they say in the Bronx or wherever, but in the Navy and the Marine Corps, they have an expression that works very well. If you can't run with the big dogs, then stay on the porch, okay? And my attitude was, yeah, I can run with the big dog, okay? But don't get pissed off when I'm way ahead, okay? If all I'm asking for is a level playing field, I'll take care of the rest. And people tell me, you don't go to church on a regular basis. I said, no, but I sit down and I pray for the benefit of my family. But when I pray for me, I say to the man upstairs, Dios mío, dame la mente clara que yo me encargo de lo demás. Dear God, give me a clear mind. I'll take care of the rest. El capitán de mi destino soy yo. The captain of my destiny is me, okay? The guy that I shave in the mirror, okay? It's not the governor, it's not the president, it's not the alcalde, no, it's me. Okay?
So, let me ask you a question. There's this thing where people say, oh, you're not Puerto Rican enough. As somebody who moved to Puerto Rico, and what would your message be to people who want to learn more about their culture, but they're being told that they're not Puerto Rican enough?
Oh, I've heard that. I don't do it to everybody, but if somebody gets down and nasty, I will not answer them. I said, no, I wasn't born here. Ah, tú no eres de aquí. No, tienes toda la razón. Yo no nací aquí. Yo escogí ser puertorriqueño. Yo no soy un accidente biológico. I chose to be Puerto Rican. I'm not a biological accident. It pisses people off, especially when you tell them, yo vengo de la gente, I come from the people who made the original economy of this island.
Can you say it in Spanish?
I said, yo vengo de la gente que hicieron la economía de Puerto Rico, And people just stare at me because everybody wants to hide their blackness. And and there's been a whole resurgence of that lately. But, everybody wants to look the other way and so on and so forth. The reality of it is that a lot of it is left out of the history. And I tell people all the time, history is written by the victors, fine. It's also written by omission. Explain to me how my biological grandmother, my mother's mother, was a school teacher in Ponce in 1890. Okay?
She's a black woman.
She was a black woman. Okay? You tell me how the entire side of my mother's family are ministers and lawyers and doctors and the whole nine yards, the Ernesto, Westervans, the Moda, and so on and so forth. Okay?
They're black people.
Yeah. Okay? Not my father's family, my mother's family. Okay? Despite all of that. Okay?
Despite slavery, despite...
all of that. You see, people, the concept of slavery, everybody talks to you and says, no, because slavery was abolished in Puerto Rico before it was in the United States. That's bullshit. It was abolished in Puerto Rico legally after 7 years later, after the United States. Okay? People don't want to see the truth. Okay? And of course, I've run into, I've run into situations in my lifetime that I'm going to take with me to my grave. Was the black side of my family racist? Not entirely, but there were classes as hell.
Right.
If you didn't belong to my class, you didn't belong. Okay? you know.
Well, let's take some pictures. Let's take some pictures
All
over
right.
here.
I think there are other things we have to touch on, or no?
Do you want to? We've been talking
You
for 2
wanted
hours.
you wanted some information.
Sure.
Information that I would give you.
What information?
Let people think. If people think of you, they see you as a color, see you less than, and so on and so forth. Let them think it. We have an expression in Spanish that I have followed for many, many years. Las apariencias engañan. In English, that would be the equivalent of don't be mistaken by the appearance. La apariencia engaña. If people think you're stupid, if people think you're less than, and so on and so forth, let them think it. You choose your punches, choose your shots, and when you're going to take them. People want to think that of you. Hey, let them think it. I've run into problems, even at somewhere I go every day at the pool. I go every day. Everybody knows me. By simply divulging information completely about my past. It pisses people off.
Wow.
I have people that don't talk to me. People on my street don't talk to me. Okay? Because their attitude is, my appearance says, you should have been at the major zenith of your life. Maybe you could have been a cop, okay?
Right.
Or worked for Public Works or something. No. Guess what? And I don't tell them anything. I have this one neighbor who's a godsend, tremendous person, who has spoken to some of the neighbors. Who, that guy? Oh, no, not him. This guy is this guy is that, and so on and so forth. Stop talking to me. I don't fit the mold. Okay? I think that's great. Okay? Let them think it. Okay? Let them think it.
Let them think it.
Okay? And like I say, if all I'm looking for, which came about with the law, federal laws and so forth, was to level the playing field, fine. I had to run twice as hard just to try to keep up. And now you're saying you're going to do me a favor, level the playing field? That's all I'm asking for. That's all I'm asking for. Don't get pissed off when I'm way ahead. Don't get pissed off. This is what you wanted because you thought you were doing me a favor? Hey, great. I became stronger than you, okay? I became stronger than you and your siblings and everybody. I'm way ahead, okay? Move out of my way.